Welcome to Paying Attention with Nicholas Gruen. This is a show where we take you beneath the surface of public affairs, economics, and government using nothing more than our secret superpower, paying attention. I'm your host, Matt Jones. Welcome to Paying Attention Question and Answer session. This is a segment where we get to ask Nicholas Gruen some less than friendly questions about some of the ideas that he puts forward. So if you're
allowed to ask friendly ones as well. I think you should warm me up with some friendly ones. And anyway, that will make the unfriendly ones work better for you anyway.
Absolutely. I mean,
let's see. Anyway.
It's a friendly idiom here. No, I mean, yeah.
Friendly, hostile questions. Let's go. You're less than fully convinced by my latest suggestion of public-private digital partnerships.
So in a previous video, Nicholas outlined his idea of a public-private digital partnership using the example of the company 23andMe. Now, 23andMe is a private company that does genomic sequencing for any individual who wants their service. I think you spit in a vial and send it off for a small fee. Is that right, Nicholas?
That's correct.
And Nicholas argues that this particular idea and ideas like it have much greater potential value if they were offered as a public good, and that they can become a public good through what he calls a public-private digital partnership. Nicholas, can you just quickly outline that idea for us?
Sure. And I think the best way to understand it is to think of the choice that companies like Google and Facebook and the not-for-profit Wikipedia, the choice they faced, which is that they're generating value for people so they could sell that value and they could say, well, hi, we're from Google. We give you the much better search results than anyone else, which they did at the beginning of this process. You pay us, a couple of $100 a year and we'll give you the search results. And Google worked out that if they made the service free, it could generate so much more value for everyone that they'd be able to make more money off a small fraction of that value, which is achieved by advertising on the platform, than they could by selling the service. So this is an example where you have the choice between providing something as a private good. Remember, a private good is sold for a fee, or a public good. And that's available to everyone for free. And you generate so much more value when you take the fee away and you provide it as a private good that you can make more money doing that by giving it away than by selling the service. Now think of 23andMe. 23andMe, I want to argue, and we'll go into this with further hostile questioning from you. 23andMe, I would argue, can generate vastly more value for the world if its service was free and it had hundreds of millions or billions of people on its database. But it can't possibly do that because I don't know what the unit cost is. It might be $50 a pop, but they sell it, I think, at the moment for $79. They used to sell it for about 149 American dollars. And so it's impossible to provide it for free. So they have no choice but to provide it as a private good. Now, when I last looked, 23andMe have 10 million genomes on their database, and that's a lot fewer than a billion or half a billion. And think of how much more powerful 23andMe would be, or rather the genomes that are on 23andMe would be, if there were vastly more of them. You could get answers out of that database much more quickly, much more powerfully, and so on. So the idea is that governments pay that extra bit of money to allow it to be provided as a public good. A bunch of other things follow from that, but that's the start of my thinking about a public-private digital partnership.
Right. And so do you mind just expanding on that? Because that's going to lead into my first question. How exactly does government create this public good? How does it sort of make the digital good free to the public?
Oh, well, it basically stands in the marketplace. It doesn't actually say, it doesn't go and directly do a deal with 23andMe. I think Ancestry.com provides a similar service and so on. So what it does is it identifies that this data would be a very useful, this would be a fantastically useful database. And so it says it would be useful, by the way, for the government. So a government that's running a public health system there is value to it in having genomic data. For instance, they can connect up that genomic data. They can connect it up to doctors who can then know that genomic data when they're diagnosing things. They can connect it up to population-based screening. So the Australian government, for instance, makes free screening available for various conditions, breast cancer for women, colorectal cancer for women and men. And so if they also have people's a partial analysis of their genome, which is what this service does, they can build that into the public health system. So this service is generating public value, it's generating private value. Governments are prepared to pay for that service, and then that's how it becomes a public good. So whoever wins the tender has an obligation to provide that they get paid by the government, and they have an obligation to provide those services for free.
Right. So the government identifies a service or a product that it thinks has value, potential value as a public good that is
Correct.
currently a private good.
Yeah.
Puts out a tender to see which company can provide it as a public good. So they'll pay that company to do that, to then pass it on for free to the public.
Correct.
So then it seems to me that the plan, the first part of the plan, hinges on government being able to identify the digital products which have the most potential value.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is historically something that governments are typically not very good at, or certainly not better at than the private sector.
Yeah.
My first thought was that once this idea kicks in, there's going to be a lot of not very good ideas or not very useful products that are sort of put out as public goods. And so how then does the government pick the digital products to turn into public goods?
So in Australia, we have quite a lot. One of the categories I would argue here, which would be a worthwhile category to explore, is online accounting. Small businesses pay about $500 a year, Australian dollars a year, for online accounting, very small businesses and somewhat larger ones. Government could stand in the marketplace and say, how much would a competitor want from us to make their product available to our constituents, people in our jurisdiction, for free? Now, those products are already commercially proven up. One is called Xero, one is called Mind Your Own Business, MYOB, one is Intuit Software. There's a British one whose name escapes me. So these are commercially already proven up. But even if somebody came along and said, no, we'll do it and we'll do it more cheaply, then, governments aren't that bad. I agree that you certainly don't want this to be cutting edge stuff, but governments aren't that bad at writing contracts so that, what's going to happen if they serve up bad software is there's going to be pretty bad take up. And that can be in the contract. If you can't, pick up at least 30% of the market within 6 months or something agreed, then we're out of here. So that's the first point. I could come up with a couple of other hostile questions. I might let you see. I might see if you've thought of them.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, so that's sort of the first half of the problem, insofar as, well, what if the product's not very good and people don't want to use it? Now let's say, what about if the product is very good? People still going to want to use it if they know that this data is being controlled by the government. So, I mean, it's the sort of question where we can probably easily point out that all sorts of data is going to places like Google and Facebook that people voluntarily sign up to.
They do.
But it is also the case that people have, there's a non-negligible part of the population that starts to get a bit qualmy about government collecting these kinds of data in a sort of centralized location. So examples could be something like the Australian COVID tracking app. Now, I know that there were lots of reasons why people didn't want to use that app. There was all sorts of...
It was terrible.
It was terrible for lots of reasons.
I think the British app has tracked one person or something extraordinary,
Right.
and ours has tracked 16 people.
Yeah, well, and
it's amazing.
And there were all sorts of problems with how the app was designed and
Absolutely.
functionality. But there were also, if we're sort of given to believe the media reaction and all sorts of opinion pieces that were coming out at the time, there were a lot of people who had privacy concerns about the government having that sort of data. So if something like 23andMe, genomic analysis, is the database is now shifted to being controlled by the government, do you get the same kind of take up that you would get if it were a private good? Or
we'll have to see. But remember, if somebody doesn't like it, they don't opt in. And secondly, if we're talking about, say, accounting data, and in our country, Xero is the dominant provider, you could have an arrangement. Well, firstly, they have the right to go and use other software. And I don't really want to take that right away from them, because that improves the quality of everyone. That's competition, and that improves the quality of everyone. They could go directly to Xero and they could pay Xero, and then Xero would have no obligation for that data to be available to the government. So this is a completely opt-in system. The governments can do other things. They frequently do things, for instance, when to try and reassure citizens so that they provide good information for the Australian Bureau of Statistics on the census or whatever. They make undertakings that this will not be available or won't be available for certain purposes to the tax office and so on. So there are all kinds of ways to handle this. And at every level, the answer is kind of yes, but so what? Yes, we're not in utopia. But, if you take the COVID app in Australia, it was absolutely useless. 50% of people downloaded it, like I did. Then I got rid of it after a while when I saw how much power it took up and read reports about how useless it was. It's just part of as we used to say, the rich tapestry of life. It's one of the... It's part of the repertoire, and we haven't even explored it. That's the sad thing.
No, fantastic. Well, so I guess in that sense, it's sort of an exercise in public trust as much as providing a...
No, it's not. It's not. It's a market exercise. If people don't want to be part of it, nothing I've suggested forces them to be part of it or degrades any other options they have.
So I'll contest you on that point.
Good. Excellent.
Yeah, because, thinking again of 23andMe, the genomic analysis company, so does turning that into a public good, though, kill any possible competition from other companies? So not only killing potential substitutes for consumers, but also killing innovation in that area? Because
so the way I want to set it up, I think would do the opposite. So what I'm trying to do is to sort of unpack the various, there's a term in sort of telecommunications, unbundle, that's it. So I want to unpack or unbundle the various services. So 23andMe provides a genomic analysis service. Now, in fact, I'm almost certain it would subcontract that to another company or companies, and it's really a kind of an integrator. So the way I see this working is that the commercial activity helps us identify services that would be good candidates for public-private digital partnerships. That's step one. Step two then is to approach those companies, or rather to have a tender, have public discussion about whether this is a good thing to do, decide that you're going to do it, and then with government, if government plays its cards well, and that's the prompt for your next question, but we'll delay that until we've got through this.
Sure.
So if governments play their cards well, then what happens is that 23andMe can be a service provider here. So can Ancestry.com. You might have a tender in which you're trying to get the best possible price. An alternative is that the government simply stands in the marketplace and says, we will pay any consumer the first $79 of this kind of thing, providing that data then becomes available to government. Mm-hmm. Okay. So there are different ways of playing that. You can see that second way of doing things intensifies competition. Further, one of the ways in which competition is going wrong is all that there ain't no competition for all that data that Google's got. Google's using it. Okay, so government getting involved in this process unbundles the various bits of it and says, 23andMe and Ancestry.com can compete with each other, and that intensifies competition there. They can compete with each other on how they serve up that data in web pages to customers, mm-hmm. and they're each doing that differently. And then there is public data. And ideally, I don't really want the government running the public data database so much as governing the public data database, and they need to govern it so that it is it's anonymized in certain uses, not possibly not in all uses, depending on what makes sense and so on. They also govern it for its openness, so that after 2 or 3 or 4 years after a tender period has ended, all that data can be moved somewhere else, and it remains continuous as a source of data. So what ends up happening is that government is using its convening power, its financial power, to be the architect of a system which is maximally competitive, because it's keeping things open. It's not allowing a gold rush to data to close it and exploit it for one party only, so that Ancestry.com and 23andMe.com would end up as apps on a larger platform. And the platform would be governed to a substantial extent by government, but quite possibly also in the same kind of way that the internet is governed, which is with lots of companies having their say and there being a general set of understandings about how to run this public good.
So you sort of already alluded then to the issue is the crux of this is how well government can foster this competition as opposed to sort of quashing it, I guess,
Well, just mucking it up, just buggering it all up.
So what's the kind of, I guess, because this is, I'm the skeptic who is unsure how well this can be done. What's the kind of inoculation you can give an idea like this to try and make sure that it's more likely to succeed?
A very interesting choice of words by you, inoculation. It's a good use of word, but it's also a kind of risk-averse use of a word. And so what I would say is the main kind of inoculation, the main thing I would do to avoid risk is to do things experimentally, make sure that coercion is minimized. That's kind of the main thing. I do think that I'm wanting government to learn how to do a bunch of things better than it does. I'm wanting it to move just ever so slightly into the 21st century and to the online world. And I think that can be done. We can maybe talk about this I'm sure we will talk about this in other videos with different methods of governance, but to anticipate some of those ideas, I'd be very happy for a council of consumers of this system to produce, to be paid to deliberate on the governance of that system as part of the entire ecosystem of how it's run. And ultimately, the principles here are pretty straightforward. So long as we keep government's mitts away from sort of taking control of things and producing them rather than helping them being governed, I think that we can meet the tests that you're proposing.
Fantastic. Well, I might leave the questions there. You've actually fantastically preempted our next video, which is going to be the principles of public-private digital partnerships, to sort of give us a sense of what principles government will need or would need to potentially make this kind of idea work. But I think you've done a pretty robust defense of your idea.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
And you know, greetings from tropical paradise.
Greetings from the Mars rover.